Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us. I'll wait just a minute or so as people log on. We're excited to welcome you to the 2026 Annual Experts Historic Preservation Lecture Series. I can't believe it's another year. And here we are. And we're looking forward to this year series on parks, historic parks and preservation in Hawaii. Okay, so I think people may continue to log on. Feel free to say hello in the chat and just aloha kamana. Great. And yes, let us know where you're logging on from. It's always great to know since we don't have you in person. Okay, I'm going to get started. So the series, first of all, my name is Andrea Nandoskar, and I'm the Education Program Director at Historic Hawaii Foundation. And make sure you're in the right place. Thank you for joining us for the 2026 Annual Experts Historic Preservation Lecture Series. The series is curated and co-sponsored by the UH School of Architecture's Historic Preservation Graduate Certificate Program and Historic Hawaii Foundation. This year's theme is Preserving Hawaii's Parks, and today's presenter will set the backdrop for the series by providing an overview of the different types of parks, national, state, and city, their origin and purpose, and a few of the preservation successes and challenges. Types of parks include those built to memorialize a site, specific history, or historical event, and parks that were created as parks and became historic over time. Just a note, yes, all the lectures are being recorded and will be posted to HHF's YouTube platform within a day or two of the talk, and also on the HHF website event page. If you have questions arising as we go through the presentation, please type them in the chat box on the Zoom menu bar, and our presenter will respond to them during the Q&A portion at the end. As always, we will do our best to address as many as we can. We'd be grateful also. There's a short, brief survey at the end that will pop up when you log off, and we'd be grateful if you can take a couple of minutes. It's short, just to provide feedback. It's very helpful. For those new to Historic Hawaii Foundation, we're a statewide nonprofit. We help people save historic places. These are sites that tell the stories of the multi-layered history of Hawaii. We do this through education, advocacy, assistance, and protection of and for historic places. I'd now like to introduce our series co-host and today's presenter, Dr. William Chapman. William Chapman is Professor of Architecture and Director of Historic Preservation Program, School of Architecture at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa. Educated at Columbia University and Oxford University in England, he specializes in architectural recording, the history of historic preservation, and materials conservation. Widely published in scholarly journals, Dr. Chapman has also written on subjects ranging from plantation ruins in the U.S. Virgin Islands to the Wright Brothers National Memorial at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. His most recent publication is Architectural Guide to Honolulu, Oahu, with Martin Despain, Don Hibbard, and DeSoto Brown, published in 2026, which is very recently. In addition to his international work, Dr. Chapman has conducted research and teaching throughout the Hawaiian Islands, including cultural resource surveys for the National Park Service and state agencies. Without further ado, I give you Dr. William Chapman. Thank you so much for being here.
Wow, thank you very much, Andrea, for such a nice introduction. Aloha mai kako. It's such a pleasure to be here again. It seems like it was just yesterday. We were doing the experts last year. Last year was the first year I got to come back from being a dean for 7 years, where I wasn't able really to conduct the program. And we had, of course, Ralph Kam very ably standing in for me. And we all, of course, miss Ralph. And it was 2 years ago that I got to talk about William Murtaugh. And William Murtaugh was the our founder, so to speak, the founder of our feast. And Bill set up this program when he first started teaching in Hawaii in 1986. So Andre and I were talking a little bit about it ahead of time, and I think this could be the 40th year. It could be the 39th year, but I think it's the 40th year, which we haven't marked in any way. And I started doing it 32 years ago, so I feel very attached to the program. For years, we used to hold it at the Palace and in the archive building at the Palace. And I remember I would stand in the front of the building, kind of hoping someone would arrive. And gradually, we got a pretty good regular group of people following us. And I'm not looking at the chat right now, but I'm assuming some of those loyal followers are back with us again. So this was a project we decided on. It was really something that Kirsten at Historic Hawaii Foundation and Andrea and I talked about what we could do for a theme. We've always done a theme. Last year it was architectural conservation, because I had just finished the book last year on architectural conservation in the Pacific region. And this year we're doing parks, and I still keep getting pulled into doing things on vernacular landscapes and parks and things like that. So this was kind of a pleasure to research it. I want to thank Don Hibbard, my good buddy, who supplied some good information. And I got to say that online you can find a study that Don and Andrea did about parks in Honolulu. So that was a very useful resource. So let me get moving so we'll get through it all in time. So this is so there were multiple efforts. So, oops. One of the things that's interesting about this is that parks are both historic places, and the second part of this, they often encompass historic buildings, like some of the parks, say, on the Kona coast of the Hawaii Island, and of course the Pearl Harbor, the Arizona Memorial, but the parks themselves have such a long history in the Hawaiian Islands that they, and over time, have acquired their own kind of significance. So everyone understands and realizes that Thomas Square, dating to 1843, was the first designated park in the Hawaiian Islands and in Honolulu. As you know, too, this was to mark the return of the Hawaiian Islands by Admiral Thomas, who gave a speech and conducted a ceremony on July 31st, 1843, to return the islands to their previous sovereignty that had been seized by a kind of renegade Lord Paulet, who had taken the islands in February of the same year, but they were being returned to the people of Hawaii. And that's where, in fact, our motto comes from. This is a map showing Honolulu at the time in 1900. This gives you a kind of sense of the location within the city at the time. Quite early in there was a mistake there. As the 1870s, the semicircular pathways were introduced then. Archibald Cleghorn, who had his estate in Waikiki, Idaho, he donated the banyan trees in 1883, and they would end up still being a feature of the site. So Catherine Richard and Robert Thompson, who became known as Thompson and Thompson, they were a husband-wife team, redesigned the park in the early 1930s. And they used some of the more mature trees that were there, but introduced other features and other pathways. They introduced this sort of stone wall along the Mauka side of the property. They introduced trellises and other things that kind of gave it a more usable character. So here's an overview of it from above. You can see something of its scale and its location there. The fountain itself was donated separately. It was donated to, it was dedicated to Beatrice Castle Newcomb, and this was paid for, and it was the Outdoor Circle that sponsored it. The Daughters of Hawaii in 1938 added a plaque attesting to the importance of the park and Hawaii's continued sovereignty. The second big park, and we have another speaker, if you look at the schedule, who'll be talking about Kapiolani Park in more detail. So I'm just going to say a few things about it. But this was set aside by King Kalakaua in the 1870s, and it became a dedicated public space in 1877. There's a kind of complicated history. There were memberships and leaseholds involved in this. Some of the sort of Kama'aina haoles were involved in owning property along the beach, and that was tied to their membership in the Kapiolani Park. That eventually kind of fell away, but you can see here its main interest was as a race course, and that was one of the things that was appealing to people at the time. The Honolulu Cricket Club also used the open space for a cricket pitch, and here we have an advertisement for a race taking place in Kapiolani Park. In 1898, it would become Fort McKinley for a short time. It was basically a tent city for the American Expeditionary Force as they headed out to the Philippines. But otherwise, it continued in public use. The Honolulu Park Commission managed the site following the overthrow in 1893, and the city and council assumed control. City and county rather assumed control in 1913, and then it was permanently set aside for recreational use. So recreational parks were kind of a slow development. In my study of like Central Park many years ago, I came to realize that parks were originally thought to be kind of passive places, a place where you communed with nature. That was very definitely what was behind Central Park and Boston Commons. There wasn't this idea of physical activity and engagement going on. But in the late 19th century and into the early 20th century, you had a movement to provide for playgrounds. In Honolulu, there was an organization called the Free Kindergarten and Children's Aid Association. It was founded in 1895, and they wanted to provide open space and opportunities for children to exercise and experience something of nature. So one of the very first that happened in the very tail end of the Republic period was Ala Park, and that was actually set up. And interestingly, it was originally called River Park, and then it got the official title of Ala International Park. It would host 2 baseball fields. It would also have a bandstand, and it definitely served the immigrant population of Honolulu. And here you can see down by there's one of the bridges over River Street, and here's a baseball game underway. I had a slide and some other information about baseball in Hawaii, but I got a little off track. But I did want to say that recent attention to Cartwright Field as having been started in 1852 is probably not accurate, because Cartwright came in 1852. And one of the things said that he laid out Cartwright Field immediately with his 2 sons. Well, neither of the sons were born until later in the 1850s. So chances are Cartwright Field was set out in around the 1870s. And but nonetheless, Alexander Cartwright, the recognized in some ways not the founder of baseball, but the first person to codify the rules through a committee he was on with the Knickerbockers back in New York, that baseball was already becoming popular by the late 19th century. And a number of schools were playing baseball at that point too. So that's not surprising we would have baseball here. So again, popular baseball venue. And you can see here the band shell that was also erected there. Now, the first kind of urban playground was the Kamamalu Playground. That was started in 1906 by kind of happenstance. It was on Emma Street. It would occupy a site that was previously a house of the Kamara family. They apparently had a sighting of a woman in white, a ghostly sighting, and they were frightened and sort of walked out on their lease. and nobody else wanted to move there. So eventually the private property was taken over by the city and county, and it was made into or at the city of Honolulu, and it was made into a small public park. It's still a kind of feature of ghost tours in downtown Honolulu. The second playground was on the corner of Smith and Baratania Streets. It was created by the Children's Aid Society and intended for boys and girls under 10, and they allowed older girls to come to supervise. And they said it was open from 9 to 5 p.m. And this is actually a photo of that under work. Atkinson Playground, which is no longer with us. It honored Alatau Atkinson. She is the teacher and inspector general of schools in Hawaii. Here you can see where it's located, downtown, not too far from Coral Street. It would later get absorbed into the industrial park that was there. And so, but here's an early photograph of it underway. And there's Ms. Atkinson in the upper right-hand corner. So in 1922, as the counties were, and Honolulu in particular, were modernizing, they would start a new recreation commission in 1922. So this earlier association turned over its 4 parks to the city. And then eventually, so shortly afterward, there were 5 new parks established. Kamakui, Gold Park, Kali'ikai, Kali'i Waina, and Kaluela were all part of the city system of parks. And you can see the kind of recreational things they had then that were probably things that we still recognize as part of parks, though it's somewhat more dangerous than I think people would want to have in parks today. Now, this is a little off the park story, but I think it's important to realize that this kind of was paralleled in Hawaii with the reforestation of the somewhat denuded upper reaches of most of the Hawaiian Islands, particularly Maui and Oahu. And there was a recognition early in the territorial period that there was so much soil runoff, and there was a real danger of losing our water supplies. And so in 1903, the territory created forest reserves to help protect the watersheds. And this had the secondary impact of actually providing for outside recreational spaces and forested spaces that we are all familiar with in Hawaii. Ralph Sheldon Hosmer was the first forester. I had a chance to write a kind of long article for the Park Service about this. I think it's online, but he really wanted to develop commercial forestry, and he was kind of defeated in that. But he did do a few experimental groves or patches. One of them still remains at Haleakala, the Hosmer Grove, which was a much overgrown version of his effort to introduce different kinds of trees into Hawaii to see what would thrive. Kind of like what the Bird Society did in introducing birds, but maybe with less drastic outcomes. So another thing that impacted thinking about parks at this period was the creation of the National Park Service in Hawaii. Now you got to remember that I think this became a national park in, I believe, the August 1st of 1916, which is actually 2 weeks before the National Park Service was formally established. So this is one of the true original parks, though. Yellowstone did in some senses precede that, and some of the military from Yellowstone actually came out to Hawaii to work on creating the park facilities. It took quite a while to acquire all the land that was part of the park. Immediately it was just a kind of designation, but gradually, mainly working what was then the Bishop Estate Trust, they gradually acquired more of the land. It was advocated by none other than one of the chief agents of the overthrow, Lauren Thurston, who was very bullish on bringing tourists to Hawaii. Thomas Jagger, and the Jagger Center is, of course, named after him. And then appointed governor Walter Freer was also behind that. And they brought out congressional delegations to look into this possibility, and they were entertained. There was other parks considered, but basically they ended up with Kilauea and Haleakala. Now, the park already included facilities. The Bishop Estate was beginning to develop the property for vacation homes, and sort of focused on Volcano House, and that kind of put a stop to that. And so when the park came in, Volcano House remained under a special relationship, and this is what Volcano House would have looked like at that time. This was basically the third volcano house on the site, and the first one was a grass building. The second one was a frame building. And that frame building was actually a wing of this building, and miraculously would survive a fire in 1940 that destroyed this building. And simply because the frame building had been moved away. So that's actually one of the few remaining buildings of the kingdom period in Hawaii, dating to 1877. So if you go over to Hawaii volcanoes, you can see that. So this is Volcano House, and of course it would be replaced by the present Volcano House only in 1941. And they had their grand opening in November, just a couple of weeks before Pearl Harbor. All right, the thing that also helped fuel this effort on Kilauea was the Kilauea Military Camp, which was established the same year. And this again was an effort by basic commercial boosters who wanted to bring the military over so they would spend money in places like Hilo, and then the Hilo merchants could also provide supplies to the camp. So it was sort of based on the idea that you needed to get away from the hot environment of Oahu. But oddly enough, I mean, most of the troops, the garrison was stationed in Schofield, which was relatively high altitude, and it really wasn't that much need for a cooler space that it was compared to the hill forts of or the hill communities of India, where the British would go in the summertime to get away from the hot spells. So this was a very important part of the whole operations from the very beginning. And some of the buildings that are there actually date back to 1916. So Haleakala was really pretty remote. Very few people went there. Lauren Thurston, oddly, used to take people up there and as a youngster, and he would show people that, but there was no road until 1934. I said 35, but I think it was 34 that it actually first got opened. And so people had to really rough it to get up there. So it was a remote park, and the two were combined in a single park called Hawaii National Park. So in the meantime, the other counties and other municipalities, which we didn't really have after the consolidated government movement, but in the 1920s, some of the other counties began to create recreational parks. An early one would be Spencer Beach Park in Kawānanakoa, and that's I got to know that one because I've been writing something about Pu'uko'ala Heiau, and this was adjacent to that, and that heiau became part of that county park in a way. And in fact, the Sons of Kamehameha would add the Royal Order rather of Kamehameha would add some steps up to the heiau and some other things to make it part of the park, and with an intention of honoring the site as well. So back in Honolulu, we had something that kind of came out of as an outlier, which is Irwin Park. It was named after William G. Irwin, an early merchant in Hawaii, and it was donated by his daughter, Helene Fagan. And it was, again, designed by Richard Thompson. Almost very early on, you can see here from the scene from probably just before the war, it started to get used for parking, and that's been a kind of problem all along. But this was a very generous donation. It's gone through a lot of renditions and a lot of pressure to put more parking there. And it's a continuing effort on the part of Historic Hawaii Foundation to preserve it. So here you can see it from above, and this was taken in 1951. And you can see how much of it's occupied by parking, though the canopy trees are still there, in fact. So, well, in the 1930s, Hawaii, like other parts of the United States, received a lot of money through the New Deal programs. These are different make work programs, but there were also the WPA programs, which provided funding to hire people to work on projects. And these are photos that show people gathering for this labor. There was also a civilian conservation corps active at Kilauea and Haleakala, but also at Kokei. And the one on the right is Kokei Camp. So Kokei wasn't part of the park system yet, but it would later become a state park, and it was already in people's minds on the way to becoming a park of some kind. They weren't sure what, but they were concerned with soil stabilization and things like that as well. And the one on the left is Haleakala. So once again, Honolulu kind of led because it had more money, more influence. So the Ala Moana Beach Park would be one of the most ambitious projects of this period. Catherine Jones Richards later took the name Thompson outside the profession in her professional life, and they did a preliminary plan in 1931. And the one fell off for some reason. Preparation work began in 1932. So this was basically a kind of marsh-like land along Ala Moana that was not really built up as it is today. So this was really a creation out of what was there. And I think you can see this is a later proposal by Lester McCoy, who headed up the Honolulu Parks system at the time. And here you can see his plans, which would be more or less realized in the park. But this is what it looked like as they were providing fill for this. Again, Honolulu Dredging provided Hawaii Dredging, rather, the Dillingham Company provided a lot of this fill for this and the excavation to create what's there today. So a young architect named Harry Sims Bent, he would be the principal architect for buildings within the park, and he also did a lot of work at other parks. So there's a portrait of Bent. Don and I were talking about finding a portrait, and this is the same one that I thought I'd find a better one, but it's actually the same one that Don had found for his study for the Historic Hawaii Foundation. And here's one of the characteristic features, a bridge. Sometimes it's referred to as Art Deco, but Deco tends to be more sort of vertical and punctuated. This is more in a modernistic tradition, and he used these kind of curving forms in a lot of his architecture, including private buildings as well. So you can see the work underway, and you can see some of the features that would still be there at a later date. And here, so again, it retains a lot of these features. There's this sort of gateway area. You can see these sort of modernistic, art moderne gateway area, and then on the left is another section of the park where you have more formal elements. And here you can see that one earlier in a photo when it was first completed. But like what was going on in New York and other cities, they also had more active recreation built into it, including tennis courts. Now, in 1938, Louis Mumford, who was a very famous city planner, he was involved with the American Institute of City Planning exposition at the New York World's Fair in 1939. He narrated a film called The City that was shown there. He wrote a very important book called The City and History. But he had been invited out by Lester McCoy to take a look at parks in Hawaii, and he wrote a pamphlet. Really, it's about 70 pages, a short book called Whither Honolulu. And in this, he kind of celebrates the climate of Hawaii. He has comments on urban areas as well. He talks about how there's a need to think more about climate in the design of buildings and orientation. He thought you needed to have coolness and breezes and things like that. Sort of as my colleague who worked on this book on Honolulu, Martin Despang, would call it the easy breezy design. He also did talk about urban renewal. So he wanted to keep the better buildings, he said, and then tear down the rest, which is kind of predicting what would happen in the 1950s and 60s. And he also advocated for what he called more oriental gardens. He thought we needed to have more Japanese and Chinese gardens. And he also advocated for more formal gardens. But the main thing he pressed for was the sort of linear connection within Honolulu. And he pressed for the development of the freeways. Unfortunately, his freeways were kind of, I think, right along the coast. They would have been kind of a disaster. They were elevated, but can you imagine? I've seen pictures of some of it. It would have gone right out into Waikiki. But he wanted to link the parks and make it a kind of continuous chain of parks. So again, unfortunately, his efforts were interrupted would be interrupted by World War II. So let's get back to the parks that were getting developed. Another one at the same time, just about the time that he came out here, was again Harry Sims' Mother Waldron Playground. It's been a subject for the development of the rail project because it was one of the properties identified when they were developing the rail. So Hart had to deal with this in some way. It occupies an area over in Kaka'ako that I think many of you are aware of. Part of it was actually cut off on the Mauka side to create a separate street at one point. And so that sort of diminished the size of the park, but you can see the architecture is still very much a part of it. And you can see the character of the this sort of modernistic design that was typical of Bent's work. The Kawānanakoa Playground, also Harry Sims Bent, that opened in 1937. But this is maybe a little more deco-esque with a mixture of modernistic and deco. And that actually incorporated a previously existing fountain, which was the Margaret Blasingame fountain, which had been installed in 1934. And here's an example of the decoration of the fountain. He also worked at Haleiwa Beach Park in 1938. And this is somewhat a different kind of design. It's sort of more stark and simple with these sort of columns and these pergolas along the beach side. And you can, in the distance, you can see some of the park buildings as well. So World War II would interrupt a lot of this park development. And there's a nice scene of Waikiki with the barbed wire. They were that early on in the war, of course, they're very concerned still about being invaded. And in fact, it didn't all end with Pearl Harbor. There was people who have a history bent will know that there were shellings of Hilo and other things during the early months of the war. I did a study for the National Park Service about the impacts of the war on the parks, and I think they wanted to have me talk about all the training that was taking place in the parks and how damaged the parks were by the training. But to tell you the truth, there was very little training in the parks. The park superintendent Wingate pushed back against the use of parks. The Ka'u Desert area was used a little bit for tank training, but that came to an end. And Haleakala was supposed to be the site of a radar station, but that was never completed. And the Kalapana coast was not even used for aerial training. But what did happen during World War II is because there were so many service personnel here, they had huge numbers of visitors for the first time ever. And so the monthly attendance or entries would skyrocket from a few handfuls to thousands actually. So it was really something that put the park on notice that they may need to start thinking about how mass tourism would be handled. And this was particularly true for Haleakala, which in a typical visitor month, they might have 30 or 40 visitors, or now having several hundred. So that was a sort of unforeseen outcome of the war. All right, so in the post-war period, both because of the need for tourism or the recognition that tourism was going to help fuel the economy, all the counties started basically developing beach parks. Now, a lot of these have been casual beach parks before, because the oceans were accessible by people, but they weren't really managed as parks. But by 1947, Honolulu would have 28 beach parks and 38 playgrounds. And the other islands tried to keep pace, but never got the same kind of numbers as Honolulu. But so mostly the parks would include shelters, toilet facilities, changing rooms, and then of course guard stations over time. And these would be how they would help support that. They would also have sort of pergolas at the park and places for barbecues and things like that were all part of the development of the parks as city-owned parks. So a lot of architects in the 1950s and 60s were involved in this. Vladimir Osipov, probably our most famous modernist architect. Richard Dennis, who I keep promoting because he designed the temporary buildings up at UH as well. He did some park buildings. Frank Slavsky, Takashi Anbi, and Pete Wimberly all did different structures within the park. So it was a big piece of employment for architects in the post-war period. Probably most famous addition to the park was Alfred Price's design for the entrance to the Honolulu Zoo, which began was built in 1963. And again, a really handsome building that seems to suggest very much a sense of the place of the time. Now, the state parks were kind of, again, a somewhat later development. They came kind of late. Most of them were started in the 1960s. They tended to be larger. They often focused on natural wonders. Some of them had a beach component, but many of them were not beach parks. And so that was kind of a division of wealth, so to speak, larger, more inland state parks, and then many, many municipal or county parks around the beach edges. So among the historic parks, the parks that were really designated to preserve historic remains would be Mo'okini Heiau on Hawaii Island, on Kohala, and then the Russian Fort, Fort Elizabeth, on Kauai. And both of those would be state parks that preserve historic resources. Now, Kokei State Park was a big development. The Park Service in the 1940s came out to look. They wanted to establish a large natural park on Oahu. And they also really wanted Kokei to become part of the Hawaii National Park. They eventually realized there were just too many private inholdings that they were going to have to buy out, and that really didn't have the money to do that or the will. And so this would eventually be designated as a state park with people holding leaseholds within the park where they still retain property at the upper end of the park. So, but the Park Service did expand. The Hawaii volcanoes and the Haleakala became separate parks in 1962. And then the park went on to develop new parks. Pu'uhonuohonau, which was called City of Refuge originally, was made a park in 1955. Pu'ukoala in 1972, and Kalakau Honok Kahau in 1978. These would all be done in part to preserve important ancient sites. The City of Refuge, of course, this large compound is the traditional Haunau, and then Pu'ukoala, the temple built by Kamehameha I prior to his conquest of the Hawaiian Islands in 1791. So this is these were but they were also done to kind of support tourism. There was a proposal, in fact, to develop a highway from Kilauea right down through Mauna Loa, so that you could get from there to Kona side in about 20 minutes. That was fought off by people, so that didn't happen. There was a certain amount of resistance. All of these parks also had very active organizations, in these cases, Hawaiian organizations that wanted to have a continuing role in the stewardship of these parks. So that is an important part of their stories. Now, the U.S.-Arizona Memorial was also made a part of the Park Service system, and not only in 1980 was a part of it. And though it had been developed through the Navy before that, and the Arizona Memorial by Alfred Price again was built under the time of the Navy management of the site. And it again recognized that tourists would be coming, and as many of you know, it's gone through many phases and a redevelopment of its main interpretive center. And for a little while, it was part of the Places of Valor National Park, I think it was called. Now it's back to simply becoming Arizona Memorial and Pearl Harbor Park. And then Kalaupapa, which gradually was managed both by the health department and by owned in part by Kamehameha Schools, previously the Bishop Estate, and then had this, and then partially by the federal government that maintained health facilities there after the territorial period began. But that is gradually going to become more of a visitor park as the number of patients has decreased. I think the last patient is actually living now in Oahu. I may be wrong, but I think so. So this is the last park I want to talk about. This is something that Kirsten has thrown out as something I should talk about, but it's a little complicated. Some of you may have followed it. So this is Kahana Valley, and it's called the Apua'a Kahana Living Park. It's a state park. It's about 5,000 acres. At the time it was designated in 1965, there were a number of people that owned parts of this, and among them would be Doris Duke had some acreage there, and Mary Foster had some acreage. The heirs to Mary Foster owned acreage there. But there were a number of people living a more traditional lifestyle there as well, and still living very much a quality of Native Hawaiian settlements, though modernized by new building materials and new transportation and things like that. So the state came up with this idea that should be a site where these existing residents, I think there were 46 families at the time, would be allowed to stay there, and they would be called upon to somehow interpret the site for people as part of the cost of them staying there. This was shortly after, the establishment of the Polynesian Cultural Center in 1962. And Lalani Village, so many people still remember, down on Waikiki. And I think they thought it could be kind of a place for people to experience something of Hawaiian culture. That mandate gradually kind of eroded, and there's as recently as 2017, OHA has had considered taking it over and developing it in some way to underwrite the lives of the people still living there. And so this is still something very much up in the air, but the park did step in to preserve this open land. So the future plans for Kahana are not really certain at this point. So today, the park system, there are over 50 state parks. I got different numbers. The AI response is 50 or 51, but maybe 52. Oahu has as many as 500 local parks. I think it was 502. Kauai has over 70 local parks, and other islands are kind of comparable. Most of them have about that number. The state parks are spread throughout the Hawaiian Islands, and the county parks still tend largely to be the beach parks. and some of the urban parks in the towns. So we can all agree that the parks in Hawaii have a very important part in our present identity and our recreation. And it's interesting to realize what an important history they have and how they even now preserve a lot of features of past efforts to create these recreational places, which are then in turn themselves now historic places. So that reaches the end of my lecture. So mahalo nui for listening to me, and look forward to any comments or um, things we could answer from the chat.
Thank you so much, Bill. You can, if you would like to stop. Oh, great. Okay. That was fantastic and very comprehensive. We invite everyone to put any questions or anything that you might want more information on into the chat, and we will have Bill respond to it. I see that Michelle Matson has put in information. And yes, Michelle, we will be, actually next week will be a special presentation on Kapiolani Park, which will go into some of the details that you're noting here with Alethea Redmond.
And you're right, it was Wendy McAllister. I was thinking it was you, Andrea. That was Don and Wendy.
I appreciate that, Bill, but I can't take credit.
Yeah, that was a great study and very helpful.
Yeah, it was.
Go to the HHF site to do it. So
definitely. Okay, I have a question. Are any of the parks designated on the State Register of Historic Places?
Yes. Several of them are, including Moana Park. The Mother Waldron Park is listed. Thomas Square is listed. Kawānanakoa and some of the other smaller parks are all listed on the state register, the Hawaii register. Yeah.
Thanks, Bill.
Some are listed on the national register as well.
If, yes, the parks, I can say you can search for them on the HHF website too to see the nominations, especially I know that we have the state parks that Bill just mentioned on our website, so you'd be able to read more about them.
Thank you, Michelle, for filling in about the Kapiolani Park. And I didn't want to get into too much detail, and because we got someone else talking about Kapiolani Park, so they'll probably cover that.
Sure. Palmer Haftel asks, was the guest planner Rudolph Weingartner? Do you know what he means by that question, Bill? Guest?
I don't know. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Palmer, if you have more context around that question, were you talking about a specific park or just the parks in general? Also, let's see, another question is,
did I miss some up above? I think I may have missed some up above.
I haven't.
When you said Kamana, hello, Kamana, nice to see you. Kamana was part of early field schools we did with the Hawaii volcanoes. A great fund of information for me along the way.
Yes, it's good to see Kamana. It's good to see everyone here. Are there any additions to the national parks more recently? For example, Honolulu would be one, and national trails.
Well, there is the Akai Trail that's is a sort of linear park on the Kona side of the Big Island of Hawaii, and then Honolulu, I kind of take some pride in knowing went around with Jeff Burton, and he was the archaeologist who'd done quite a bit of work with the confinement camps in California, and we went around, and I was on a committee with several people at the Center for Japanese, what is it called? Help me out, Andrea. Center for Japanese Culture.
Oh, Japanese Cultural Center of
Yeah,
Hawaii.
yeah. And we had bi-weekly meetings, and we were talking about how we could honor Honolulu. But when Jeff came out, we went to Sand Island and we went over to Honolulu and kind of felt we kind of discovered it. You see these pictures all the time of all the tents and everything, but they hadn't been found yet. And so we were just kind of like pushing through the brush over there to figure out what was here. And we identified the kind of culverts and things like that. And then luckily that we had some good contacts with Daniel Inouye's office, and they suddenly decided that this deserved to be a park in its own right. And so at one point, the argument from the Park Service is they tell this story completely adequately already with the parks in Manzanar and some of the parks in California and other places. And they didn't need to have a separate one for Hawaii, but luckily they came through for us. And then so it is going to be developed with a visitor center.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you. Yes, Historic Hawaii Foundation has also been involved in planning efforts and support for the unfolding of the visitor center and the designation. And actually, Honolulu National Historic Site they have an exhibit. I think it's still there at the Downtown Arts Center. They did a whole series of events for the 10th anniversary this past year. And if you check the National Park Service website under Honolulu, I believe you'll find links where you can watch some programming, lots of virtual sessions, lots about the history, and also information. And also HHF, we were lucky to bring some students out who are studying under a program under Building Industry Association of Hawaii to see some of the preservation work that has been done on repairing the rock wall. As Bill mentioned, there aren't a tremendous large amount of features, physical structures remaining from that site, but there's some very significant elements. And they also repaired a bridge, and so we got to see that. Jumping back to June had asked a question about why we chose the theme of parks this year. Is there a concern that the government is withdrawing funding? I think that's what you might have meant, June. I'm not sure. It wasn't a political decision, but I'll let Phil, if you want to respond.
I'm just going to fob it off on you because it wasn't
no,
my idea.
It was
from
just
you and Kirsten.
We just thought there are the two different aspects of parks, those that have become historical, but also those that were built for significant sites or cultural or other elements. And we just we haven't done that before over the course of experts, and thought that would make a really great series. Another question is,
I see something from Laura.
Oh, okay.
Laura, it's really interesting. I had a couple of slides about Moana, and I decided that was going to be distracting because they're not designated local parks. But the Outdoor Circle, right after it was completed, did contribute trees. But it wasn't until the 1950s that they actually paved the walkways on either side of the Alawai so that you could use it. So I just wanted, and Laura is making a case for not building the footbridge. I could see her point. I'd like to have a smaller footbridge that was actually a footbridge. I spent some of my sabbatical in London, and they have footbridges over the Thames, which don't obstruct views, and they actually provide you an opportunity to have views. And for some reason, when we do something in Honolulu, it keeps getting bigger and bigger, and so they want to have so the fire trucks can go over it as well. And that kind of kills the whole point of the modest pedestrian bridge, which I think is be quite doable. Since I live in the Marco Polo, I would be really welcome to a nice modest pedestrian bridge to take me directly over to Waikiki without having to go down to Macaulay Street. I think it would be great. Most of my neighbors feel the same way. So something tells me if they were dependent on federal funding, then we're not going to have anything happening with the bridge there, but we'll see.
Thank you for that, Bill. And Laura, you bring up just the notion that that there's complexities with preserving these parks along with preserving anything. There's lots of elements and layers and work that is done behind the scenes and sometimes in front of the scenes to have the best outcome for the resources. What are the another question, what are the opportunities, Bill, if you came across this, and we'll get into this in the directors forum, which is the last of the series in February 18th, but what are the opportunities for preservation and stewardship at the parks? And how can community members get involved or help with preservation? Is that something that you have any thoughts on?
I'm going to pass that one on to you because
Kirsten, maybe.
You're probably more of a conduit for volunteerism than I mean. I'm a humble teacher of preservation. We try to get our students involved. We do projects with the National Park Service still, and we involve students in this kind of work. But I agree with Laura. It is a dangerous pedestrian and bicycle bridge.
I think for volunteerism for that question and stewardship, I hope people will continue watching the series, and I definitely think the Directors Forum will be a very good venue to ask questions like that, as the state parks directors, the state park director, and also the county directors will be able to address what their needs are and what their issues are in their individual parks and overall. So please, I hope you will register and attend that.
We have a panel discussion with something unique to this.
Yes.
And we at the end with a number of people from the state parks and DNR and other places involved in that. So I think you'll like that. That'll be interesting for me too. Yeah.
Thanks, Bill. Thank you.
Back to Palmer.
Yes, and then I also, after that, I wanted to address Maureen's.
Lewis Mumford. Lewis Mumford is.
Oh, that's right. Thank you. Also, there was a question posed to the panelists about the change in name. Thank you, Maureen. It's great to see you here. Of Pa'ulaula State Historic Site, formerly known as, known as the Russian Fort by. It has been corrected. I would direct you.
It's in my text. It's in the text.
It is, but Maureen is asking, the name has been corrected and it's submitted to DLNR. Why is it still listed as the Russian Fort on Historic Register? Maureen, let me check into that and get back to you separately. I can discuss with Kirsten and our staff and look into that.
If it's the original nomination, it's kind of rare to get the names changed on the original nomination. You would have to go in and make an amendment to it. So I guess nobody's felt motivated to do that.
Thank you for that, Bill. Maureen, also, if you want to put something into the chat to everyone with a link to the website that you have, and that will share information about the change of the name and also the monument that was installed, I think that would be great. Let's see.
It was interesting. I was approached by someone from the Russian consulate once. This was maybe 20 years ago. And they wanted to commemorate the site. And they were proposing shipping over stone from Russia, they said, where they would reconstruct it as a proper fort with Russian stone. And I said, I don't really think that's kind of the direction people are trying to go in. So we kind of put a stop to that. But there was definitely tried to get a number of boosters behind him on that to develop it as a proper stone fort. That was before all the new stuff for the Russians, before Ukraine and all that.
I'm glad we're staying away from politics. Bill, is there anything else? We're getting close to wrapping up right now. And thanks to everyone for your questions.
I do want to mention that next week we're going to have Aletha Redman. I'll be here to introduce her. And she is with the She's the president of the Kapiolani Preservation Society, the Washington Park Preservation Society. Bob Wyanath, one of my earlier colleagues here in Hawaii, wrote a very nice book about Kapiolani Park, so you can find it. Wendy Wickman gave me a copy once as a for being her supervisor, and I still value it greatly. So I'm looking forward to Aletha's presentation next week.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Maureen. Maureen just put a link to, and I can include that when I send a follow-up later after the series to a link to that website. I want to thank everyone so much. I want to reiterate your words, Bill. Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you hopefully next week. Everything's being recorded. We'll have that up as soon as possible. I also just a quick reminder to please just click and take the survey as you log off. And yeah, if you have additional questions, feel free to shoot them over to Andrea at historichawaii.org, and I can field them with Bill. And the more preservation focused current situation type things I can field with our director to Kirsten Faulkner, who works on a lot of the projects. And with that, thank you so much.
One very quick thing. I hope Maureen
realizes
I thought it was ridiculous too, if it didn't become evident that I thought that was a ridiculous idea. So
I think you made that clear. Thank you,
All
Bill.
right.
Thanks for clarifying that. And thank you everyone so much for joining us today. We hope to see you next week, and be well, and ahui ho till we see again, and mahalo nui. Oh, thank you to Shanae Kamaka Wiwo Ole, my colleague at Historic Hawaii Foundation, our operations manager, who's been providing tech support. And of course, Bill, thank you for taking time. I know you're teaching again from your schedule to create such a wonderful program and
I enjoyed
presentation.
it. I spent the weekend in it here at work, but it was worth it.
Oh, thank you so much. Appreciate it. I hope everyone stays well, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks for joining us. Aloha.
Aloha.
Mahalo nui.